Hello, and welcome to the Circuit Breakers interview series. I'm your host, Steve Semler, and today I'm joined by Josh Smith, who's the co-founder and CEO at Toovio, an innovative data technology company. Josh, thanks for joining us. Would you like to kick us off with a brief background as to who you are and what you do?
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks, Steve. Co-founder, CEO of Toovio. Toovio's been around for, I think, about 13 years now. My background started in data analytics, mostly in the first party data sector. So that would be organizations that have an existing customer relationship where the customer has opted in to share information and allow the organization to track that information. So a lot of those types of channel interactions that I would be involved in trying to insert intelligence and stimulate some behavior to get a specific outcome that usually has a monetary value. Would have been things like direct mail, email comes along, lots of digital channel innovation where we have apps, and it just keeps getting more and more interesting on what those channel interactions look like, but the mission is still the same. And that is to, if you were to take a CEO of any company that you interact with as a customer, if that CEO could insert their intelligence to every customer interaction, that would be the ideal situation. But obviously human labor doesn't scale that way. So we use things like technology, and automation to try to insert that intelligence in ways that don't require a human being. So a lot of that's statistics, algorithms, and now we call this stuff AI. So I've been working in that space for about 24 years now. I started in retail, places like Limited Brands. I'm from Columbus, Ohio, originally. Victoria's Secret stores, Alliance Data Systems, and then I moved up to Minneapolis to work for Target Corporation and had some really cool experiences there. And then that was sort of the first half of my career. Second half has been almost entirely in software, working for software companies, implementing systems integration for software companies. And then presently, Toovio is a software as a service, a B2B software as a service marketing technology company that at the core of it is a decision engine. We are making customer interaction level decisions to affect outcomes, customer outcomes that have monetary value. And so the idea is we talk to a prospective client and we talk to them about how many customers they have, in what channels they interact, what those interactions are worth, and how can we make them better. And usually that is all centered around the experimentation of what kind of content, copy and imagery would be content, what kind of cadence, timing, discounts, redemption windows. Those are all sort of dimensions of experimentation that we leverage machine learning and AI pretty heavily to make those decisions and understand the winners and losers. That's really what it comes down to, is the classification of what works, winners, and what does not work, losers, and how quickly we can iterate through that experimentation to find, it's a game of inches. So you're trying to find the things that work, and you're trying to rapidly expand on that performance. So Toovio is these days, Toovio is almost entirely focused on mid-market and sort of small businesses in e-commerce. We found a really nice space for ourselves in specifically Shopify, the Shopify ecosystem. The data and channel integration in the Shopify ecosystem is very elegant. It's well structured. It's the same for every business. And so with our mission statement of trying to monetize first-party customer data, the more reusable our efforts are, the better it is for everybody.
Neat. How did you decide to start the business for Toovio? Go into it from that.
It's funny because it's been a long run. It's like 13, 14 years since we started it. And part of that story is the rise of the customer data platform sector. And its initial hype cycle and where it is today It's also a story of cloud, and the rise in, in the hype cycle of cloud infrastructure. As I mentioned, my background, I've always had jobs where my mission statement was to insert intelligence into these customer interactions and try to monetize the outcomes. But it's really the infrastructure that has increased in sophistication over time that has allowed us to scale this type of work. Because historically, I would say most of this kind of work was fundamentally based on human labor, which was only tenable for large enterprise type organizations where they had millions of customers and they could afford 30 people on their data science team, or 50 engineers, or whatever it needed to be to achieve the scale. So we only had human labor previously to throw at this problem. And now with AI and machine learning, there's so much automation, there's so much scale to scripted ways of doing this kind of stuff, which, as I mentioned, experimentation is a big, it's a big part of this, because you have to discover their performance. This is not an appliance. You don't plug it in and it just prints money. And I think a lot of folks sort of overlook the importance of that piece, but creating a framework with automation, AI, machine learning to discover that performance is a lot easier these days than it was 15 or 20 years ago. So I got into this because just an anecdote, when we first started Toovio, Rackspace was just becoming a thing. And one of the cool things that Rackspace was doing at the time was they had an elastic cloud. So you could play around with your CPU versus your RAM configuration in a programmatic way, which was really fundamentally a prerequisite to be able to leverage some of these machine learning algorithms. Because making a decision in real time and what that CPU parallel processing needs to look like versus building a model offline, the CPU and RAM configurations were dramatically different. And to do both inside of the same tech company with physical infrastructure was a challenge, frankly. So yeah, Rackspace kind of opened the door for us. We had fundamentally had a thesis that we could offer this as a service and make this kind of technology accessible to companies that required an operating expense model instead of a capital expense model. The largest enterprises, they can CapEx this kind of technology and it works really well for them. You come off that Fortune 100 or 500 list and it has to be rationalized as an operating expense. So the cloud made that possible for us.
Yeah. Well, how do you arrange the testing, the experimentation, so that it's the AI engine doing it versus Josh saying, okay, here's the A/B test on this variable. Here's the next dimension. Here's the next dimension. Here's the matrix, multidimensional matrix of these things.
Yeah.
How do you set that up so that just happens and you're collecting the data?
Yeah, that's such a great question. So there's obviously experimental design principles where you could draw an analog to, say, vaccine efficacy and double-blind placebo type approach, and it's important to understand those principles and to follow them. But to answer your question directly, the real special sauce is a data stream that in the Toovio ecosystem, in our stack, we call it the closed loop data stream, is an event-based record of everything that happens at the customer interaction level. So when we go to create an experiment, invariably, you're going to see a data stream underneath that experiment that's going to have events at the customer level that have labels such as trigger, decision, presentation, engagement, and conversion. And let's just call those the verbs, right? When you get to the adjectives, and I can't take credit for that, verbs and adjectives. Somebody really smart said that to me one day. When you get to the adjectives, now you start to talk about test versus control. So we made a decision, but you may, Steve, have ended up in the test group, and I, because of some random selection, ended up in the control group, and I'm labeled as such as an adjective against that verb of decision. And so that data stream fundamentally is what underpins all of the AI and machine learning capabilities. So if you use experimental design principles to architect that data stream, those verbs and adjectives, then then fundamentally you have the backbone that enables experimentation at scale.
Hmm.
Some people use terms like attribution analysis, et cetera. But if you think about your average organization today, you might ask them a question like, do you ever run an experiment? And they may say, yeah, we do. And so the follow-up is, well, how many did you successfully run last year? And some of the, best organizations may say something like 2 or 5 or something like that. And the reason it takes so long is because they're not orchestrating a data stream as I'm describing programmatically. They're not using
Hmm.
technology to orchestrate that data stream. What they're doing is they're running the experiment with human labor
Yeah.
in a one-off manner. So maybe they're using just database tables, some Python scripts. They built it in a lab, they scored a table, and then another tool picked that table up. And each step in the people and technology process that they put together manually is not keeping a consolidated record of everything that happened, and therefore is not repeatable, and therefore not scalable, and so forth. So, we could we could go pretty deep on this. A lot of reasons for that is because in many of these organizations, unlike, let's say, Instagram, statistically, we might use the phrase objective function. The outcome that we're trying to optimize in, let's say, a retail or e-commerce, there's 30 of them, or there's 50 of them. There's
Hmm.
not one objective function. And so this complicates the thing and makes the problem even more challenging. Whereas in an organization like, let's say, Instagram, time on platform is quite an easy objective function to focus on because it drives the P&L in ways. And I'm sure they have more than obviously one outcome, but I think there's just kind of some classic problems. And furthermore, most of these organizations, it's not their core business model to be amazing at AI and machine learning.
Right.
So they have to acquire that talent. That talent has to acquire the technology. They all have to, the roles have to talk cross-functionally, collaborate well together. It's a difficult thing. It's in some ways an unnatural act. As one of my dear mentors used to say to me, an unnatural act for some of these organizations to collaborate cross-functionally.
Yeah. So taking that complexity into account, how do you boil that down or simplify it and explain what you're going to do and the value of it to the SMBs that
Yeah.
purchase that?
Well, yeah, I'll tell you, it's a wild. Well, I myself and some of my co-founders, we spent a bunch of time in Western Europe before Toovio, and in that telco Western European space, it's a fierce competition, highly saturated markets, very customer centric, very competitive, and therefore there are easily identifiable people in those organizations that care about outcomes, that care about taking data and driving outcomes. um, Not to be sort of dismissive or critical of the US in general, but like in our geography, our enterprises are far less competitive, and it's more about capabilities in a sense. So when you're at that enterprise level, we all want these new cool capabilities for the sake of having the capabilities. But when you move down market into mid and smaller businesses, you're talking to, more like C-level or the owners, in fact. And those folks absolutely care about results and really, to a large extent, are not too concerned about how
Yeah.
those results are happening. So you focus on outcomes to answer your question directly. You focus on identifying the outcomes that matter, giving them monetary attribution, and then
Mm.
fundamentally working backwards from the outcomes, which is a sort of a different way to think about it. That wasn't possible, let's say maybe 15 years ago, because you had to work at it left to right, because you had to start with conquering the human labor and solution problems in order to just try once to affect the outcome. Now a lot of those things are gone. Human labor is removed in so many ways from the solution part of this, that where things get lost today is you take like a data science person and you take a business stakeholder person and they're not speaking necessarily the same language, the more that they do speak the same language and the more that their transparency of their collaboration, the better the result, just flat out. And so when we work with these e-commerce businesses, it's all about outcomes and experiments and the speed at which we can iterate through the experiments, because there will be losers. So the faster you can identify the stuff that works and the stuff that doesn't, and drop the stuff that doesn't and refine, translates to dollars.
Yeah, that's the principle behind it. That's what we're looking at from a results standpoint, is how can we stop doing the things that aren't adding the value we want? How can we do more of the things
Yeah.
that are?
And I'll tell you, like, it's not to belabor the point, but there's two processes that are happening in the Tuvio stack. There's a find the performance and there's a grow the performance.
Mm.
And it actually has to happen sequentially, because let's say that you start with an e-commerce business and you start running 20 different experiments, 20 different campaigns. The reality is the performance of those campaigns are variable. So some will work, some will not. And you must discover that performance first before you start to iterate, because there's actually a profile of the performance, which we call volume, conversion, and value. So you might get great performance out of a certain campaign, but it's a very low volume, and therefore maybe not worth your efforts of iteration. So the discovery aspect of experimentation is hierarchical. It happens on multiple levels. And as soon as you start to get into that game of experimentation, you immediately realize that, and you immediately perform this perspective of like, oh, I have to take this step first, and then that tells me where to allocate my resources subsequently.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it is pretty obvious. It's just, I think because of things like human labor and cost of solutions historically, we've just naturally, focused on different things historically. But yeah, it is pretty straightforward.
Yeah. Um, so from the standpoint of things changing and business landscape and requirements and the technology and the business and things going on, how is it that you and your team stay adaptable and open to change? What do you do to break the circuit of the routine and stay focused on innovation?
Yeah. Well, I have been the simple answer is it's a first principles mindset. That's classic Aristotle first principles. We have to have a mission statement, and it must be clear amongst our team internally. So our mission statement: driving incremental revenue or value on first party customer data. So we always know that when we do different things and try different things, like, does it align with the mission statement? With first principles, that allows us to boil things down to axiomatic truths, what's true and what is not. And from there, you essentially are experimenting with things that reduce human labor, that speed up experimentation, et cetera, et cetera. So one of those, just give you an example. Um, ultimately, the human role, you look 10 years ahead, et cetera. The human role is about engagement and approval. It's strategic. The machine can do all these great things, but ultimately the human needs to be presented with recommendations, and have the human needs to have that ability, the business owner in this case, to say,
Mhm.
I agree, or I'd like to edit or approve or deploy this kind of stuff. And it needs to be steered like that. And you can argue that that shifts and goes through different transformations over time, but like, that's ideally what we're trying to accomplish. So when you think about our customer being an e-commerce business, and we're perhaps talking to the business owner, that means we need to have some kind of expectation of not only the questions that those business owners would have of us, but how we would answer them and in what format.
Yeah.
So when we try to innovate, generative AI is obviously the easy topic to point to. It's how do we use generative AI to speed up experimentation, to proactively recommend, reach out to the business owner and say, we think you should do something different, and here's what that is. and if you approve, we'll go ahead and do it, you know, because they're busy people, and they don't have the, maybe the same time as like an enterprise team of 30 data scientists might have. So, it's very tailored to our mission statement. It's very tailored to our mindset of first principles. And then in between that, we can test a bunch of stuff. Like, I think the OpenAI stack right now, the copy part of that, the ChatGPT part of that is great. It's obviously getting better with each iteration, but right now the image generator it's not production ready for our purposes. It's kind of cute to see what it can do, but we can't just take images out of the DALL-E generator right now and just use them in production emails. It's just not where it's at. So there are limitations, and we're constantly sort of looking for new solutions. But again, it's so important to have a mission statement, because it's the measuring stick by which you determine all these things that you try, like, is it actually making an impact? Because there's certainly a lot of cool stuff out there that's shiny, that maybe doesn't move the needle on your mission statement.
Yeah. Well, let me turn to kind of the future for Tuvio. If you could wave a magic wand over your business and make one thing better for the next year, what would that be?
Yeah. Well, we have some big things coming up in probably June timeframe that I'm very excited about. Like I said, working in the Shopify ecosystem allows us to not have to worry about some of the traditional problems of like data and channel integration that were not usable from one client to the next. So it's allowed us to like accelerate our innovation. And what we're going to release here shortly, is a bot that essentially, that you can have a dialogue with as a client of Toovio, that will allow you to launch and refine experimentation. And that again, our core focus of driving incremental revenue on first party customer data, experimentation is how we do that. But it's the diversity of that experimentation, it's the volume, and obviously there's efficacy, and so there's sort of this like composition of what it means to accelerate experimentation. And the hardest part, the biggest problem, again, kind of back to first principles thinking, the biggest problem to solve there is how does our client as a human engage with those characteristics of experimentation? And the faster it is, the more effective it is, et cetera. I mean, it translates to dollars, which is our mission statement. So I think, from a future looking standpoint, that's the high level, that's the roadmap, is that we're going to adopt generative AI, and we're going to marry it with our current experimentation and machine learning capabilities to create this bridge between human customer, our customer, Tuvio's customer, and experimentation. And if you think about, I'm heavily influenced by everything I hear Elon Musk say. One of his famous quotes is, the building a prototype versus like figuring out production. It's like an order of magnitude more difficult, 100 times, 1,000 times more difficult to figure out production. That's exactly what I'm talking about. The production of experimentation is the nut to crack. And so the idea that the only physical limit to what we will create in the future is the amount of time that has to pass in the experiment to gather enough data. This is an analogy to say your production vehicle should be the cost of the raw materials, right? So the time that has to pass, and this would be very closely tied to the size of the business. It would be tied to the frequency of purchase, average order value, all these kind of characteristics of the business themselves. But if you could run an experiment in real time, and the only constraint was the amount of time and the number of observations, this is the ideal future state.
Yeah. Getting it down to that ultimate efficiency point.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Hmm.
It's like physics. What are the physical limits we can aspire to? You still need to run the experiment and therefore collect the data. So time passing, number of observations, these are physical limits.
Cool. Well, pulling back the camera to kind of a bigger picture view, what advice would you offer to aspiring entrepreneurs in the tech sector, who are just starting out or facing challenges in their businesses?
Yeah, probably two things. One is I've heard great quotes and advice around, you can always kind of tell when you're talking to a first-time entrepreneur because they're focused almost entirely on the product.
Hmm.
And second time or third time entrepreneurs will tend to not entirely, but be thinking more about distribution of the product. And I'm the data guy for Toovio, and I'm the product guy for Toovio. So I'm certainly I've been through that. I'm guilty of that. Um, and I think it's an interesting balance to whether you find that those two mentalities in multiple people, or you have the discipline to park time on your calendar to separate out those two activities, uh, is a big deal. Because ultimately we're trying to launch a company, we're trying to grow it, trying to scale it, and those two go hand in hand. But I could certainly find a lot of people that would argue that distribution is more important than the product. But again, it is kind of back to like, you've got to have a good product, because it's got to make it when you figure out distribution. So this is like chicken and egg kind of thought, but you need to have both. It doesn't have to come from the same person, but they have to move hand in hand. The second thing that I would say is, these things are hard. And there's a mindset of gratitude for the suffering that I think is, some people use words like grit. Grit is passion and resilience. That sort of, you hear those sort of words. But the idea that like it should be hard and you should embrace the challenge and you should be grateful for the challenge, because if it's not hard, something's probably wrong. And so it's kind of like, I'm sure my first point, you might have a product-minded person like myself that doesn't really understand the value of the perspective of distribution. And that might be out of my comfort zone. And it might be really difficult for me to do that. But I have to, and I have to be grateful for it and I have to lean into it. So that mindset of gratitude, it's definitely helped me in more ways that we have time to articulate it. I've heard all kinds of advice, like, for entrepreneurs, like, don't tie your personal, confidence and optimism, don't tie your personal life to the professional reality of the startup. Separate these things. And that's, I've been able to do that through gratitude, because there's certainly times where I have not been able to do that, and that will tear somebody apart and make you pretty miserable. But I think it's the mindset of it's difficult. It should be grateful for it, and it will give you energy. It will inspire you, when you hit the hard times, rather than tear you apart.
Yeah. Some elements of wisdom there as well.
Yeah.
And
So some direct experience.
and often we take the data and the meaning from it, and that turns into information that we then collect the wisdom from. But you have to, like you said, you have to have had the experience. You have to have done the experiment, collected the data, and then done something with it.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's like, just more, maybe bring it up a level. It's like, save your emotions and your passion for the right problems, you know, because I mean, you can spin your wheels on things, and you can get into dark places because things aren't going well or whatever. But, a lot of that gets, when you do that, you're wasting precious, because it's finite, right? Your ability, and your day to day, it's finite. So optimizing that with whatever mindset works for you, to make sure that what you have can go into the right problems, to like you say, extract that wisdom from what's happening, is kind of everything. And I've had some really great mentors that have said things to me in the past, like, Josh, you're the only one that can build this deck. you know it can't come from anyone, because it's you're the author, you're the origin, it's your mission statement. And man, it took me a long time to really understand that, really digest some of that wisdom.
Yeah. Well, let's hope folks can take the wisdom that you provided here as well. I appreciate it. Thank
Yeah,
you so much for your time, Josh.
my pleasure,
Um,
Steve. Yeah.
Great meeting you and learning about Tuvio and how you managed to bring this forward with making the experiment repeatable, ongoing, and it's the distribution of the experiment that's key.
Yeah, it's
Uh,
why last 10 years, we'll see where it goes. But at last 10 years, these things, I mean, you just look at OpenAI and what they're doing and how much better it gets with each iteration and how it affects everything. It's a revolutionary tool in the box, but I would encourage all these sort of tech, founders to think about how that technology and that innovation fits into your mission statement and moves the needle for your mission statement because I mean, gosh, I mean, you just look at the catalog of APIs, the different functional APIs that are in OpenAI as of today. And obviously, you've got other big platforms like Grok and others coming along, Gemini, et cetera. And it's sort of an overload in a sense. But just keeping that innovation in the context of your mission statement. Have a mindset like first principles that allow you to sort of figure out what's working, what's not. That discipline's not. There's no substitute for that. We'll get crazy innovation, but there's no substitute for that discipline.
yeah, good words to live by too.
Yeah.
So for those watching, when you're faced with challenges in your business, consider these tips, consider first principles. Feel free to reach out to me for coaching and training support. As always, I'm Steve Semler at FocalPoint Business Coaching, helping techies be great leaders. Look forward to seeing you in our next episode. Thanks, Josh.